College football nerds here to talk Rose Bowl, Oregon, Wisconsin. We've talked about both your teams a little bit, not enough, so we're here to discuss it. Want to remind you, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and your only homework for this game, besides sharing, if you like what we're talking about, make sure you share us. That helps us out a lot. But really, what we want you to do is get in the comments business and let us know what your score is going to be and back it up with data. All right, Josh, we're going to go into this one, both feet. Look, Wisconsin and Oregon, it's so weird to me that they both have a loss that's like a really bad loss, but these losses have been forgotten by everyone in college football. And in a lot of ways, I think it's fair that nobody's talking about Arizona State, nobody's talking about Illinois. They're talking about these teams in the context of who they've beaten, and it's almost like they have both the same wart and nobody's talking about it. Is that fair that we've sort of forgotten these losses?
I'm not sure everybody's forgotten the losses, right? I mean, a lot of people do realize that Wisconsin lost to Illinois, that Oregon lost to Arizona State. But I do think we've kind of, if we haven't, maybe forgotten's the wrong word. Maybe the word is ignored or looked past them.
Forgiven?
That's a more merciful word. The problem with Wisconsin and Oregon both, and we were talking about this before the show, they've looked like playoff teams at times, and they've looked like teams that shouldn't be in the top 25 at other times. And I think that's why the losses have been kind of glossed over. Wisconsin loses to Illinois. It was kind of viewed as, oh, well, that was the week before Ohio State. They're looking ahead. Oregon, well, they had pressure on them against Arizona State. Both those games, they look like the better team for a lot of the game. Oregon actually really, I should say, probably looked like the worst team for most of the game temporally. But at the end of the game, when they realized that, hey, we need to win this, they did turn it on. And it felt like if they'd had another two corners, they would have won by 20. They were just kind of duds. I think the thing that's almost more concerning for me for both teams, like with Oregon, it's, yeah, you have the loss to Arizona State, but there's also that really close win against Washington State and against Washington. It's the fact that there are multiple games for these teams where they were kind of, not great. Wisconsin, a close win over Iowa. I don't personally really buy into Iowa that much. They kill Michigan and they turn around and having a bit of a clunker against Northwestern. I think both these teams sometimes just don't click. And I think it's because they're both very physical teams. They're both teams that really have the potential to be explosive offensively, but depend on a lot of things working. With Wisconsin, they really got to get Taylor going, and the passing game is very hit or miss. Oregon has been really disappointing from the production that's gotten out of Justin Herbert. I mean, at times he looks like the first-round pick he was made out to be. But they've had a lot of issues with not having the receiving core they would have liked to have had this year. And then Herbert's, like in that Arizona State game, is just absolute head scratcher at times. And you can see, like the Michigan game and the Utah game, what they can be. So we kind of forgive these two teams because of how good they are in some of their wins. But you also have games like 7-38 against Ohio State. I mean, we remember 21-34 with Ohio State, where they were up in that game, where it looked like they were going to win, and we kind of looked past 7-38 against that same Ohio State team. I mean, which one is Wisconsin? Are they 3.7 yards per play that they were in the first game, or 6.1 from the second? I just don't know, and I don't think there's... Obviously, they played the same team twice, and you have different results. There's no way to answer that question.
Yeah, but I mean, even that game shook out somewhat similarly from the defensive standpoint, where Wisconsin was pretty decent first game, 2.5 quarters, and then it kind of fell apart. Same thing in the second game. It's also interesting to me that Oregon has somewhat, I will say there's been a couple of games where they didn't, like Washington and Cal, but somewhat feasted on teams that weren't great passing the ball, even that could run the ball. Utah can run the ball, and they can't really throw it. And Wisconsin is similar in that regard. Wisconsin obviously got an elite future NFL star, I think, running back, got a pretty good offensive line, but not great in the passing game. And for me, that is a little bit of a kind of fitting into Oregon's wheelhouse. But then we look at the Auburn game. Auburn couldn't run it or throw it against Oregon or anybody this year, really, and had pretty good success enough to win the game because they had a good defense, and Wisconsin's got a good defense. So does this boil down to, I hate to say this because this is kind of silly because, we're so numbers driven, so much on analytics. Is the winner of this game just going to be the team like in the NCAA playoffs come March that just gets hot on this one day where they play them again tomorrow and they might lose?
I think that's probably honestly the answer. Do you mind if I go ahead and get in the model to start addressing that?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So, we talk about percentage of opponent averages allowed. So if they average 4 yards per carry and you allow 3, your opponents average 4 yards per carry, you're allowing 75% of their average. Oregon and Wisconsin's defensively, they're like mirror images of each other. And that's why I wanted to bring the model up on this point. Oregon allows 83% of opponent rush averages, Wisconsin 79%, and then 82% of opponent pass averages and 83%. Defensively, very similar. I think Wisconsin has more of a reputation just because of their past history and how physical they are and big. Oregon's been just as physical and just actually more effective. I mean, they're higher ranked in terms of total yard per play stats, which, we look at yards per play. Oregon's 16th, Wisconsin's 19th. I mean, they're very, very similar in that regard, but they're also really similar offensively. Oregon's 4.8 yards per carry, 8.3 yards per attempt. Wisconsin's 5.4, 8.3 yards per attempt. Same passing average, slightly more rushing average for Wisconsin. I think it's interesting that they have the same passing average given I think what would be a very different perception of the passing attacks in the two teams, but that is kind of where it's at. And again, when you talk about team averages, you know what the opponent rushing average is for both teams? 3.38 yards per carry allowed. The same number. And it's 6.2 yards per attempt allowed and 6.3 yards per attempt allowed. So statistically, these teams are extremely similar. The one slight edge is that Wisconsin runs the ball a little bit better and maybe stops the run a little bit better. And that's about it. And that in our model, I will say, is counteracted by the fact that Oregon scores a little better than Wisconsin does. And that's probably we talk about this a lot, that the new style offenses are a little more effective at scoring than old style, pro style offenses. Pro style offenses are better at generating stats, but not necessarily points. So our model thinks it'll be about 5.3 yards per play for Oregon, 5.4 yards per play for Wisconsin. That tiny edge balances it out. And it actually has this game at not just 23 all, it has it at 22.7 to 22.7. It's a dead heat.
That's the closest one we've ever done. That's crazy. And that supports what we were saying before. It's not just that we don't know a whole lot about either one of these teams. They've actually played. I mean, Wisconsin's played in conference some pretty good opponents. One really good opponent. And Oregon has that Auburn data point. They have a couple of decent in conference teams, and then Utah, who we actually think is better than the other people who the people who follow this channel, watch a lot of our content, have given us a hard time about being high on Utah. I think they're a better team than they're getting credit for. Let's do this. We usually do picks and then talk about some hypotheticals, but I want to talk about hypotheticals before we give our picks. If this game is a high-scoring shootout, let's say the score of this game is 42-35. Is that automatically straight in your mind that's Oregon winning that game?
I think so, honestly. It's kind of unfair when you talk about the fact that there's really not anything. The stats don't back up the perception, but I do think when Oregon has gotten to high-scoring games, it's usually because their offense is clicking. When Oregon's offense is clicking, it's really freaking good because of what they have at the quarterback position and because their offense just kind of hinges on how well the quarterback and the wide receivers all click and work together. It does favor, in my mind, Oregon in a higher-scoring game.
And it's interesting. My next question is going to be about a blowout. Both of these teams have blown out a good team. 35-14, I think, was the score over Michigan, and that came out of nowhere. And people want to say that Wisconsin beat an early Michigan, that wasn't very good, and then Michigan's trajectory throughout the year got a whole lot better. I don't agree with that. I think Michigan played some mediocre teams that they matched up with pretty well there in the middle of the season. I think Wisconsin beat Michigan. They beat the crap out of them. And then obviously we have everybody's going to say, well, Oregon beat the crap out of Utah. They're on an upward swing, but 2 weeks earlier they lost to Arizona State. So if it's a blowout, if it's 31-10, you think that's Oregon too?
I think either one of these teams could win 31-10. I do think it could easily go either way.
All right. So then why don't you give me your score and then tell me how this Wisconsin team is different in this score is different than the one that Oregon played earlier in the year, because neither one of them really had a great quarterback. Sorry, Auburn is the other team that Oregon played earlier in the year without a great quarterback.
I am going to pick Oregon. I'm going to go, I'll say 31-24. I have zero confidence in this pick, if you can't tell. I do think I just hedge towards Oregon being a better team. The difference in my mind versus the Auburn game, and a lot of our perception of Oregon is based on that game, Oregon had no receivers against Auburn. They won that game for 3 quarters. They had a really crappy fourth quarter and gave up points to Auburn, who, by the way, Auburn does not have a good quarterback, but Auburn actually does have a lot of talent. And what we've seen throughout the course of the year, like with LSU, with Alabama, all of a sudden Auburn can just score points. And they suck most of the time, except when they don't. And they just kind of bit Oregon in that game. And I will say Auburn's defense is very good. But I think Oregon would have been a lot more successful in that game if they had a receiving core. There was a real reason. It's funny, we did a preview and talked about the receivers all being hurt. Everybody told us we were wrong in the whole comment section on that preview. And then we were right about it, which, by the way, was random. Nobody knew that they actually were hurt. It was just kind of being hidden. But that's why I lean Oregon. And it's tough. Like you said, evaluating these teams is hard. Our model is at this point in the season, it's mainly based off, it's based off who you played and how you did against them and how good they were. But that's all siloed. So there's no way for me to really compensate for the fact that Oregon plays in the Pac-12, Wisconsin plays in the Big Ten. How do you equate those two things? You can't. The Pac-12 was 0-3 against Power 5 teams in the winning record. Out of conference, not counting Notre Dame. And I'll say, caveat and aside, shot across the bow, I think Notre Dame is absolute fool's gold. They're often overrated. This year, I think they're particularly overrated, and that's part of the Michigan narrative. But I call it eye test. I feel like Oregon's the better team.
I've got Oregon 23, Wisconsin 20, and it's interesting. Wisconsin's favoring this game, and we both picked Oregon, and that's not normally the case. Usually, we disagree. I mean, we've disagreed this week, but usually if someone's favored, one of us will pick them. Like you, I think this could go either way. I think that there's a chance that there's something that we're not thinking about, in that Wisconsin's defense might just shut Oregon down. I think there is an outside chance that happens. I think there's an outside chance that it's a 27-7 type game. There's also a chance that Wisconsin's running game is physical and powerful enough that Oregon can't hold up to it, although I think Oregon's defense is underrated. I think Oregon's offense is a little overrated. But nobody's talking about this Oregon defense, who, by the way, everybody's talking about Chase Young. Oregon might have the best pass rusher in the country. I mean, he's a little younger. Chase Young's probably going to go first or second overall based on need, but I think Oregon might be sending a guy first or second overall here in the future, and based on their recruiting, might have a couple more coming. 23-20 is my pick. I wouldn't be shocked if Wisconsin wins this game. Not shocked in the least. I do think whoever gets hot in this game, or maybe has something happen for them early, because this is where we get back to the 9-game schedule thing. And neither team is going to want to hear me complain about this, but this is reality. In Wisconsin, I will give the caveat, they have played teams in the past out of conference, and they are working in the future to improve their schedule. But this year, we know very little about Wisconsin other than how they matched up against Michigan and Ohio State. They didn't play anybody out of conference, and they play in the weaker division in the Big Ten. Oregon didn't play anybody in conference and lost to Auburn out of conference. First game of the year, I get that. Had players out, I get that. But this is why you talk about how it's hard to model. It's hard to eyeball too. And that's why we have so many questions. That's why I wish we were playing 8-game conference schedule, mandated 2 out of conference, because then we would have so many more data points about how these teams and conferences match up against other teams and conferences. Anything else on this game before we shut it down?
I'll make one comment on that point. When I was digging up the data on conferences versus Power 5 conferences playing each other, one, the Big Ten was 2-1 against other P5 teams with a winning record. But the more notable point, in all of college football, the entire season, there were only 6 out-of-conference games between 2 P5 teams that ended up with a winning record. Not ranked teams. Only 6 games between teams with a winning record. Of those 6, 4 actually featured SEC teams. And I think there's arguments on both sides with the 8-game or 9-game thing, but to your point, and I agree with it, the reason 4 of those 6 were SEC teams, and the reason that SEC had 7 games against P5 teams with a winning record, whereas the Pac-12 had 3 and the Big Ten had 3, is because they're playing more out-of-conference games, especially more meaningful ones, because they've got 4 out-of-conference slots. That's been the cost of the 9-game conference schedule, and you can talk about it being fair or unfair, but it definitely has made it more siloed and hard to evaluate games like the Rose Bowl.
And when we complain about this, people always say, well, I don't care what it is. It just needs to be equal. It needs to be the same number of conference games. I disagree. I think it needs to be 8, because what we've seen with conferences that have gone to 9 is that a lot of their teams drop that meaningful out-of-conference game. And that's, like you said, that's been the cost of that. I mean, Minnesota didn't play a Power 5 team out of conference. Penn State is playing Pitt every year. And this is not, I'm not bashing the Big Ten. I'm just saying you're playing an extra conference game. What are you doing? Well, you're dropping that meaningful out of conference game and you're filling it with cupcakes. And yeah, you can say what FCS all you want for SEC or whatever, but SEC number 1 in terms of good games out of conference. ACC's number 2. There's an obvious correlation there. Both of them are playing 8-game conference schedules. We need to...
Both the ACC and the SEC played against 7 P5 teams with a winning record out of conference. And then the most anybody else played was 3. The Big 12 only played 2. And so to your point, maybe it's an easier schedule with the FCS. Maybe it's an easier to have 8. But I'm fine if we all have the same number if it's 8 or 9. But I'd much rather it be 8 with at least 1 Power 5 out of conference game than go to 9 where some play and some don't. Because what we've got right now in college football is you've got 3 whole conferences. What is it? That's... three whole conferences, right, that played a combined 8 games against teams with a winning P5 teams with a winning record. Even when they're playing P5 teams, they're like the Pac-12. 5 of the 8 had a losing record. They are mostly playing teams that they know aren't very good because they can't afford the loss, because they know they're going to beat themselves up in conference play, and then we can't evaluate them.
And that's why I think you have to do 2. If you do 2 and you happen to get a crappy team or 2, that's okay, because you're going to play other teams that have played good teams out of conference, and it'll eventually will have enough data to make it meaningful. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the 9-team conference schedules get worse and worse. There are multiple teams in the Pac-12 and the Big Ten that aren't playing any Power 5, bad or not. There's 1 team in the SEC that didn't play, and that's Arkansas, that didn't play anybody this year. That was a Power 5, and I think 0 in the ACC, and multiple SEC and ACC that played 2, because they have those, like Clemson plays South Carolina, Georgia Tech, and then they're playing in Notre Dame, Texas A&M, so on and so forth. That's it for that rant. That's not a slam on either one of these teams. Like I said, Wisconsin is trying hard to improve theirs. Oregon obviously doing the same. And I just want better, more interesting games in college football. And that's it for that.
And I want to make one point real quick on Oregon. Oregon is the class of the Pac-12 by default because they won the conference. But I think they're about to be the class of the Pac-12 for real. I think next year, and especially the year after, they're going to start distancing themselves. You're seeing it in recruiting. No one else in that conference is investing the way Oregon is. The recruiting class this year was very, very good. They have some incredible talent coming in, guys like Justin Flo. I think Oregon was on the rise. And we said preseason that we thought Oregon was probably going to be the best team in the Pac-12. And a lot of Washington fans honestly gave us hell about it. We were right. I mean, I think Oregon is rising. And I think next year you're going to see a gap between them. This year you felt all year like they might be the best team, but you weren't sure. Next year I think you're going to know they're the best team throughout the year. And I think in about 2 years, I could easily see them being a playoff team, not all that dissimilar than the situation with Clemson in the ACC. I think they may be ruling the Pac-12 and be a truly elite playoff caliber team in what has genuinely is not an overly great conference. And I think it's going to show. And Oregon's just going to be beating the pulp out of everybody. Whether that causes the rest of the Pac-12 to actually invest resources as needed to catch up is a different question. But I think this is just the start of where Oregon's going to end up.
Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Remember, like and subscribe. Let us know your score. God bless.